So one of the most prized possessions I own is an award up on my wall in my office. And whenever people drop by, I always take a moment to show it to them because it almost seems made up. The award is for, quote, my support in destroying, for humanitarian reasons, a rogue satellite in February 2008. Yes, a rogue satellite. Today, I'll cover a range of experiences throughout my career focused on both threats, both to and from satellites. And when I say threats from satellites, I'm talking about that award-winning effort to destroy a satellite that was falling to Earth. Now, my first introduction to space was back in 2007. I had started work at the State Department recently, and I was working on sanctions, which, if I'm being honest, is not a topic I'm incredibly passionate about. But then, in January 2007, China conducted an anti-satellite test, or ASAT test, which created, I'm sure most folks here know, thousands of pieces of tractable space debris, many of which is still in orbit today. It's often thought of as the most severe and prolific fragmentation in the history of space operations. And since I was working at the State Department, I assisted with the diplomatic response and really fell in love with space issues. It was fascinating to me that we are so reliant on our space capabilities, but yet our satellites are vulnerable to so many threats. So the fellowship I was on required rotations, and which is essentially secondments across the US government, and I decided to focus my fellowship on space. And so one of my rotations was at the National Reconnaissance Office, or NRO. And for those who may not be familiar, the NRO is a US government agency that develops and operates US government reconnaissance satellites. Soon after I started working there, in December of 2007, I learned that there was an NRO satellite falling to Earth in the next 3 months. And this was a unique situation because this satellite, which was called USA-193, was a 5,000-pound satellite, but it had malfunctioned quickly after it was launched. And so on board was 1,000 pounds of frozen hydrazine, which is a very dangerous fuel. And so in January of 2008, the Department of Defense decided to form an interagency, or group of governments, agencies group, to determine how to respond to this interesting predicament. And so a one-star general led this interagency group of about 20 people from a range of agencies across the US government. So of course the Department of Defense, but we also had the Department of Homeland Security, and even the Department of Health and Human Services, given their familiarity with hydrazine. And since I was a State Department employee that happened to be on rotation to the NRO, I found myself with a new title, the State Department Liaison Officer. And so my role was to liaise with my colleagues at State Department headquarters to make sure they had the latest state of play for their diplomatic efforts to respond to this situation. We were also standing up a consequence management team that would be ready to quickly deploy anywhere around the world in case the satellite did crash to Earth. And I was responsible for identifying the State Department personnel that would serve on this consequence management team. I also had the duty of making sure that every member of the team had a diplomatic passport, because that would be required to enter a foreign country on official business. Now, there was a lot of work being done to develop the options for, at the time, President George W. Bush. And things were so busy that I often found myself working until midnight, and mass transit, there was no public transit at that hour, and I didn't have a car, and there was no Uber. And so the NRO ended up issuing me a government vehicle so that I could get home. Meanwhile, NASA and others were doing constant analysis on the chances that the fuel tank would survive re-entry and the likelihood that people would be killed as a result. Now, after various briefings on the topic, President Bush ultimately decided that the best option to mitigate the loss of human life would be to shoot down or engage the satellite using a converted SM-3 missile, which would typically be used for ballistic missile defense. And our effort got a new name, Operation Burnt Frost. Now, unlike China's anti-satellite test, we decided to make the plans very public. And on February 14th, a range of US government officials from DoD, NASA, and the White House held a press release where they announced our plans to engage the satellite. What's funny is that we announced our engagement on Valentine's Day. Very romantic, right? Now, I remember it being so crazy to me that something that had been ultra top secret was now all over CNN. But I was so happy and relieved I could finally tell my friends and family why I had been working such long hours. Now, I worked with my colleagues at the State Department to develop a cable to inform the rest of the world of our plans. Meanwhile, NASA officials briefed the plans to the UN through the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Now, the date of the satellite engagement had to keep in mind important other items such as the space shuttle schedule. And this was particularly important because one of the key military leaders in this effort was General Chilton, who was formerly a space shuttle commander. And so he was particularly sensitive to this topic. So the morning of February 20th, 2008, the Space Shuttle Atlantis has safely landed, and things were on track for our first intercept attempt that evening. Meanwhile, we had an interagency consequence management team of 90 people and various C-17 military aircrafts that were ready to deploy worldwide in case the intercept had not been successful, and they needed to go in to manage the impacts and pick up the pieces of the satellite. I had worked with the State Department headquarters to develop a diplomatic cable to ask any government for permission if we did need to go in to go pick up our dead satellite. So that evening, I sat at the NRO Operations Center with the NRO director and other senior US government officials. And we watched very quietly as a missile was fired from the USS Lake Erie, a ship positioned off the coast of Hawaii. Luckily, we succeeded and intercepted the satellite on the first attempt. And as designed, the engagement ensured that the vast majority of the debris that remained in orbit would be short-lived. In fact, just 4 months after the engagement, only 2 small pieces of debris remained, and they re-entered shortly thereafter. The fact that so many people have heard of China's anti-satellite test, but don't remember this operation, is really a testament to the transparent approach. Now, after all that excitement, I finished my rotation at the NRO, attended SSP 08, and then returned to the State Department. And about a year following Operation Burnt Frost, there was another space emergency where a satellite was threatened, this time by a piece of space debris. So on February 10th, 2009, an Iridium satellite, which is a US commercial satellite, collided with a defunct Russian military satellite. And it was the first and only ever collision of an active satellite, creating more than 2,000 pieces of space debris. One role of the State Department, in accordance with the Liability Convention, was to promptly notify Russia that the collision had occurred. And so I was able to assist with that effort and following diplomatic discussions. Now, this event, combined with China's ASAT test, really stressed the need for enhanced collaboration on space sustainability with the rest of the world and really shaped my work at the State Department for the years to come. So now, flash forward to 2018, where I am on detail to the National Security Council at the White House, working on international cyber cooperation. One of my colleagues had created a working group on cyber threats to the maritime domain. And I asked my boss if there was flexibility for my free time, in the evenings and on the weekends, to create a new effort on cyber threats to satellites, and he agreed. So space systems are really reliant on information and systems and networks, But these systems and networks are vulnerable to malicious activities that could deny, degrade, disrupt, or even destroy a satellite. And in fact, there are a wide range of malicious cyber activities that could be harmful to space operations. And that's spoofing, jamming, denial of service attacks, and injecting malicious code. And this could result in minor consequences, such as the loss of mission data. But the consequences could be more severe, and you could lose complete control of your satellite. And so an example of this type of threat was the deliberate cyber attack of the Viasat network, which resulted in a partial interruption of their broadband service, impacting thousands of customers in Ukraine and tens of thousands of customers across Europe. So in general, you can secure your space systems using the typical cybersecurity practices that you would for any other system. You know, ensuring the availability, integrity, and confidentiality of your networks. But I always like to say that space is special because space systems are difficult to physically access once they are launched. And so as a result, it is all the more important that you need to include cybersecurity considerations when you're designing that satellite from the start and throughout the whole life cycle of the satellite. So recognizing our reliance on space, but also the unique vulnerability of our space assets to cyber threats, we were able to insert for the first time in a national strategy the priority of space cybersecurity in the 2018 National Cyber Strategy. Now, to implement this strategy, I worked with my White House colleagues to develop the Space Cybersecurity Working Group. And the goals of this working group were to identify, coordinate, and prioritize U.S. government efforts to enhance space cybersecurity. And what we found early on was that often space and cyber officials work in different offices, not always communicating. So an early success of the working group was bringing these folks together to really remove stovepipes, compare notes, and provide updates. And an early conclusion of the working group was that you can't just look at the satellite alone. You need to look at the totality of the space system to protect it from cyber threats. So this is the ground stations, the communication paths, the antennas, the networks, even the spectrum. We also recognize the need to enhance partnerships with commercial space, but also internationally. And this is particularly important since our efforts in space are becoming increasingly intertwined with both commercially and internationally. So we need to ensure that all space systems, not just US government satellites, are protected. But a key challenge is really convincing others to spend the extra resources to protect their satellites when the extent of the threat is not always well known or available to the public. And so this is why we really worked to enhance our efforts on raising awareness and sharing information on cyber threats and developing and sharing best practices. Now, one area of commercial cooperation was through something called the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, or ISACs. And ISACs are member-driven organizations that really gather, analyze, and disseminate sector-specific information amongst themselves and with the government. And the US government supports the formation of these ISACs. And so we were so pleased to see the stand-up of the first ever space ISAC in 2019. And this ISAC is working now to disseminate critical cyber threat information related to space among the federal, commercial, and international community, and its membership continues to expand. Now, the greatest accomplishment of the Space Cybersecurity Working Group was the development of Space Policy Directive 5, SPD5, on cybersecurity principles for space systems, which was issued in September of 2020. And this document was the nation's first comprehensive cybersecurity policy for space systems. Now, what does SPD5 do? Well, it develops cybersecurity principles to guide and serve as a foundation for the US approach to cyber protection of satellites. And something that was clear early on is we really needed to have industry buy-in in this effort, since industry more and more is the ones developing these satellites. And so we coordinated closely with them in the development of this policy, and I was so pleased to see their endorsement of the policy when it was released. Some of the principles in SPD5 include adopting cybersecurity hygiene practices for satellite development, using authentication measures and encryption, managing supply chain risks, and collaborating to share best practices. And robust public-private cooperation is already well underway and will continue to be expanded. For example, we have a space cross-sector working group that has been stood up to bring together space industry professionals and government, and the ISAC is another place where this public-private partnership is being carried out. So while I'm no longer working at the White House, I'm very proud of this work my colleagues and I did during this time, and space cybersecurity has continued to be a key priority for the Biden administration, and Space Policy Directive 5 remains in force today. So from a satellite falling to Earth and threatening all mankind to the very serious threats of our satellites, from destructive tests, accidental collisions, and cyber intrusions, I've been very pleased to work on a range of threat issues across my career. And I'm sure that we'll continue to make progress to address these challenges, particularly as we continue to work internationally to promote our shared space situational awareness. Thanks.